Welcome to the Blonde Runner podcast with Coach Laura Erickson, where she shares her healthy living tips as a running and triathlon coach and mother of 4.
Well, hello friends, and I'm back again, here to teach you some stuff we're going to talk about heart rate training, and as we age as well, I want to touch on that. So heart rate training is very effective. It can be a very great tool to help you reach your potential. I do want to talk about some of the basics of, if you haven't ever done a heart rate training before, it's really beneficial one, but it's more accurate. I use my Garmin watch has a heart rate monitor on the wrist it can do. It's a little more accurate if you use a heart rate strap. And I found a lot of people don't use numbers at all when they're first starting. I really think it's valuable to have a GPS watch and be able to watch your numbers. That's kind of the thing that's different than when I started running. When I started running, we had just the basic chrono watch, start, stop type thing. But we didn't have any feedback on what pacing we're going or any of that. And having those type of metrics so you can watch yourself can make you a lot faster because they help give you confidence. I know for me in training, for Ironman, things like that, they give me an idea of what I'm capable of. If I know I've held a certain pacing or a certain watts on my bike, certain heart rate numbers on my run, then I know I can hold those in racing because I've done it in training. And so it really does kind of help you become better. It can also be something that can get in your head a little too much. Maybe you've pushed your heart rate too high too soon, and that's not good. But we'll definitely talk about that a little bit more. I think the biggest thing is understanding the numbers and how they impact you. So, and if you do understand the numbers, you really can't understand the numbers, or they won't mean much to you if you're really not monitoring them. So first things first is getting yourself a heart rate monitor of some sort. There are a lot of different brands out there. I particularly, like I mentioned, use Garmin. I know there's a lot of other different brands out there. But they're kind of they're trailblazers when it comes to GPS. And I like all those numbers. I like to look at everything. And as a coach, I look at all those numbers because I do run with my athletes some, but I don't run with them every single day, and I can't possibly do that with everybody I work with. So it gives me the best possible picture of actually what happened. Those heart rate numbers give us something to aim for. They also give us some kind of relative idea of our intensity level for workouts. So you've probably heard of zone training before. And if you haven't, well, this is good that you're listening in because it's important to understand what zones mean. And zones are, there's usually 1 to 5 zones. So zone 1 would be, it's a percentage of your maximum heart rate. So your maximum heart rate is what it sounds like. It's the maximum your heart rate can go, like during exertion. So most people will never really actually see their max heart rate. If you want to figure out what your max heart rate is, they do have kind of a general. It's pretty much your age minus 220, and that would be your max heart rate. I find for me that number doesn't really match up for me, and I like to go on real numbers because one of the reasons I do custom coaching is that everybody's numbers are different. Not only your heart rate numbers are different, and to get your heart rate numbers, there's a chart you can go off, and you can go off your age, but what about you? What about all the factors that make you you? What are your abilities? How physically fit are you? And, if you're a male or a female, all these things will affect that. Are you tired? Those kind of things. So heart rate should be used as a piece of the puzzle when it comes to really training well. But again, we're going to focus on that today, and there's other elements we'll definitely cover in other podcasts. But again, finding that max heart rate, like I said, so 220 minus my age. I just barely turned 50. So if I were to take 220 and minus my age, my max heart rate would be 170. But that's not accurate for me because I've actually seen 210 on my watch at the track. And on occasion, I'll get athletes who are like, what's wrong with my heart rate? Because they'll get some static and then they'll have these really high readings and they're not accurate. But I know for a fact that was an accurate reading for me. Now, So that would put my, if I just went by the charts, like I was telling you, 220 minus my age, 170 would be kind of where I need to stay, and that would be kind of my max, right? Well, I know because I watch my own numbers, of course. When I race a half marathon, my average heart rate, not just my max, not just the highest it gets, my average heart rate is between a 182 and a 185. And that is high. That is high, but that's good for me. So it's relative. My resting heart rate is between 36 and 42. So that's normal for me. I remember when I had a neck surgery when I was running in college, and I remember all the nurses and everybody came in. My alarm was going off, my heart rate was 36, and they're like, "Wow, they hadn't seen that." And I told them I was a distance runner, but that is very low. And I say that's normal for me. My average running, I can hold my heart rate at 182 for an entire hour and a half plus for a half marathon. For me, that's normal for me. Now, for you, it might be different. I've had athletes that when they hit a 181, they would be probably dead at a 180, right? But they're really pushing hard at 160. And that's fine. That's good for them. But the thing that you have to be careful of is if you use some of these charts and it's not accurate for you, like for me, that's not accurate just using a generic, because I would be running well under my potential. I wouldn't be meeting my potential in racing if I went by those numbers and graphs and things. So I think it's really important to customize the zones for you. You can actually have these tests done in a lab where they take out blood and they test your lactic acid build, and they can figure out that exact point for you. If you do a lot of training, I use the Garmin Connect app, it will over time figure out what that threshold number, heart rate number is for me for running. Now, I will say heart rate training, we are talking about running more, but I will say that in my threshold number right now is 187. That's normal for me. That threshold number, what that threshold number means is where you kind of change from being getting that energy from an aerobic process versus an anaerobic. Anaerobic is like you run out of energy really easily, I guess the muscles do, and to explain it really simply. And so you want to teach your body how to push that threshold level up, how to process lactic acid and use that to create energy. And so it's a very uncomfortable pace that is to work at the threshold pacing. But a lot of times, a lot of people don't understand how to train. And one of the reasons that it's important to kind of know these numbers for yourself is then you can know, like I can hold that my heart rate in the 180s when I'm doing like a tempo run. Tempo run, a lot of people do tempo runs wrong, but a tempo run generically is between, 25, 30 seconds per mile slower than like a 5K pacing. So it's a pace that's, you can't hold forever, but you can hold a lot longer than a short interval. So it's maybe a pace you can hold for a 20 to 40 minute run. It's what's called comfortable hard pace. Like, I don't know, that's kind of an oxymoron because it's not comfortable. It's a pace where you aren't going all out, but you are also not holding back too much. Like, it is not a comfortable pace, but if you can learn to do some runs at that pacing, your body starts to develop more blood volume and more capillaries and all these things that happen when we train, and that's how we get better. But knowing where to train and how much to train at different levels, that's where all this comes into play. That's why these numbers are good. Now, you don't have to figure out your own zones, but you can. Generally speaking, zone 1 is going to be 50 to 60% of that max heart rate. Zone 2 is 60 to 70%. Zone 3 is 70 to 80%. Zone 4 is 80 to 90%. And I will say most of your training is done in zone 1, 2, or 3. those levels. But when you start pushing it into zone 4, which is 80 to 90% again, that is when you're going to be doing your fartlek training or your intervals or something that you sustain for a while, but you can't sustain for the long races. But it's important for you to teach your body how to process the lactic acid, how to function at a level where you're building up and accumulating lactic acid. Because if your body can learn how to process it by exposing it to that, the better off you'll be. I am really simplifying the terminology and things here, but just for everyone to understand. So your zone 5, and I've even seen zone 5s being divided into zone 5A, zone 5B, zone 5C. So you can really push those levels. But in zone 5, you're going to be 90 to 100% of what you can do. I mean, you're giving it your all, that kind of workout. Maybe 400 repeats at the track. Sometimes when I'm having athletes doing repeats, I'll give them a percentage of what maybe this is an 85% effort in terms of race pace for a mile. What does it feel like? So a lot of times when I'm working with people, I do have them do heart rate training, but when there's a lot of fatigue in place, you might not be able to hold those heart rate at the high levels that you need to because you're tired. So like I said, it's only one piece of the puzzle. A lot of times when I'm having people do workouts, especially when they're starting or if they're tired in training, if they've done a training load and we're before a taper and we're still loading them, I will often have them do an RPE or a rate of perceived exertion workout where it's kind of a scale. It's sort of like the zones, except they're going by feel. So it may feel like they're going zone 5, but because their muscles are so tired from all the load, they're actually staying in a heart rate zone of 3. And that's kind of where it gets tricky. You can't always function as high as you want to because there's many factors that contribute to good training. So you can't, I think if you're doing heart rate training, you don't do just heart rate training. I think that's a really sound piece of advice because you definitely want to. I have a very eclectic approach and each athlete is different, but I never do solely heart rate training only. I do, maybe they're looking at watts if they're doing FTP on the bike. And we're doing different kind of testing for that. And so a lot of what we're talking about with this heart rate is based on running. But I will say it is very activity specific. For instance, so a lot of people I work with are triathletes, including myself. One thing I've noticed looking at those numbers is it's very hard to get your higher heart rates on the bike. And the reason why is because your muscle movement is much more drastic. The movement of the legs is going up and down. Very different. Running is a smaller movement there. But your muscle movement actually helps pump the blood. So your heart rate doesn't really get up like it would when you're running. So just a little tip, this isn't on nutrition, but that's why it's important to get nutrition on the bike because you have more blood volume to actually process that food. So that's often why you get nauseous when you're trying to eat when you're exercising because you're not used to, the blood is doesn't know where to go to, does it support the muscles? Does it try to digest? And your body starts producing more blood volume to accommodate for that. So just a little tidbit on that. But you will see those heart rate numbers aren't going to be the same on the bike. So figuring out those zones for your running is going to be different than figuring out your zones for the bike. So everybody's a little bit different. They'll be ballpark similar, but they're going to be a bit different. So you got to keep that in mind. Your muscles actually help pump the blood on the bike. So it is different. So that's where that RPE or that rate of perceived exertion comes in. If you know you're really pushing it hard and your heart rate's still not getting up, you could be getting sick. You could be fatigued. You aren't maybe recovering well. Since we're sort of touched on 400 repeats, or if you do any track work, one of the things I see a lot of people making a mistake on is they either rest too much or too little. There's a very kind of fine-tuned amount of rest that needs to happen between intervals to get the most out of your training. And that's where having a custom coach makes a big difference. Because you could go by the books. It'll tell you, do this much rest, but that might not be exactly right for you. The way that I've designed a lot of my training is actually me going to the track and running. And then I time when I feel right to run another interval. And then I I've given a specific interval to my athletes based on some of those real life data points, not just, oh, this is what's in a book. Here, you do this. That's not how I like to coach people. One particular athlete lately, she just had a PR in her half marathon. I'm very proud of her. 8-minute PR. So we've been working on getting those lower numbers for her. And on occasion, I will work out with my athletes and push them in an interval. One of the ways that you can find your max heart rate is actually pushing yourself hard enough to see what those numbers would be. And so we did that. Did a warm-up and we did a hard mile together. I pushed her like she's never been pushed. And we found out what her very hardest effort was. But it also gave her tremendous confidence because it was well below the times that she had done previously on her own. She didn't realize she could do it. And so another thing that we did was while we were running, I was able to instruct her on how to calm down and how to run more economically and better form. And it's interesting because as you are still exerting the same amount, you are speeding up by running more economically, yet your heart rate stays the same. So you can control heart rate by how economically you're running. This is where I do running form analysis. This is where running economically, really efficiently comes into play. You can, in other words, go a lot faster at the same heart rate. So maybe you've done a half marathon before. Your heart rate averaged 163. Maybe you ran an 8:05 pacing. But you started working on form. Now you're able to run a 740 pacing for the same distance and you're staying the same heart rate. Still 163, but now you're running a lot faster because that, running more economical, more efficient, and it's easier on your body. So there is a way, that heart rate number is great and all, but can you run better and keep the heart rate the same? Can you run 163 average and get down to a 740? Part of that's training, part of that's running, even when we were doing that hard mile together, we're seeing that heart rate get up. Relax, shake the arms, good lean, and then the heart rate stays the same. Or we actually ended up dropping that heart rate and still running efficient. So part of that, there's a lot of things that go into meeting, a lot of people I work with, I want them to get to their best. And so we're taking all these things into consideration and we're figuring out what's going to help them meet their potential. And so, heart rate training is one of them. One of the things, and now that I know I've done enough heart rate, had enough heart rate data when I'm racing to know where I'm at. One of the things I'm looking at, and we can't see graphs on this podcast, but I look at their data, and what I want to see is I want to see them get up to their heart rate max really, steadily, not usually it's within the first mile. They're up to what their heart rate is going to stay at. And then that line is just stays steady. No matter if they're going up or downhill, that heart rate stays steady. So maybe the pacing will change, but that's what we want in a good race, is that heart rate to stay steady. We want them, of course, fueling right. But if they're going up a hill, their heart rate shouldn't be climbing. It should be they're running more efficient, and they should, they're going to slow their pace, and that's okay. One of the things you don't want to do is spike your heart rate in a race. You don't want it all of a sudden to go really, really high. When it's really, really high, I'll tell you what you feel like. You feel like you're going to throw up. It's just too much. You certainly don't want to get that feeling early on in a race. If you do, obviously you're going too fast. You're gonna hit the wall either really soon or definitely by the end of the race if it's a marathon. These numbers are super, super important to know, especially if you're training for longer events. Like a marathon, when you've done like an Ironman. One thing I will say if you do triathlon is that often once you get off your bike and start running, I've noticed for numbers-wise for athletes, their heart rate numbers seem to stabilize and they have a little bit harder time going up. Once they've been off the bike because they're out there for a long time. And that's pretty normal. So it's something that you kind of have to look for. And the biggest thing is not allowing that heart rate to spike, but finding out what is your zone. Where do you need to be that you feel like you're running efficient and also getting your heart rate at the maximal level but you're still able to not build up lactic acid too quickly. And that's what you're doing with training, is trying to improve that number. And again, running efficiently helps a lot. So one of the things I did have that question, Eddie gave me a question. He says, he's over 50, wants to know, does the heart make sense? Does those zones make sense? Those heart rate zones make sense as we age? And yeah, they do. I would say the thing that you would consider with age overall is, as you get older, your heart is not going to be, or your vasculature, all of it is not going to be quite as elastic as it once was. So generally what we see over time is that heart rate, that max heart rate tends to go down slightly over time as we age. That's pretty normal. But again, like I said, for me, my max is not 220 minus my 50 age, and 170 would be way too low for me. I would not get anything out of that. So again, it does very much depend on you. And some people, age it definitely plays a role, but it's less than I think we think. Sometimes we kind of make an excuse we can't do anything because we're older. And I'm not, I just think, what was it, Sister Madonna, 92? I think she just finished an Ironman recently. There are people out there getting it done, and age is just a number in a lot of ways. I've noticed a difference as I've gotten older in terms of warming up and things like that. That's going to be important. But I think a lot of people are very fearful that something bad's going to happen if they push their heart rate up. And one of the reasons I run with my athletes and push them like that is because I want them to know you can push yourself. Yeah, it hurts and it's okay. You can do it. But you don't know what your max is until you push yourself to that limit. I wouldn't say you should always be throwing up or anything like that, but you do need to have those efforts where you're, it's called a time trial. You need to find out what, you need to set those zones for yourself by having tests that tell you what it is, what yours is. And a lot of times you can do a tempo run. A lot of times I'll use a recent race, but I also find that people, again, they don't know what their potential is. They're afraid to push themselves to their potential. Sometimes it's a little easier when I'm with them. So that's why I do that sometimes. It's like, okay, stay with me. Don't worry about pace. Just stay with me. That's all we got to do. And so we do that. And then they can see they surpassed what they would have limited themselves to doing. Sometimes I see more potential in them than they do in themselves. But once they start seeing the potential I see in them, and they start seeing that in themselves, then they can pull it out. And I think that's really key here. So yes, heart rate zones are valuable. They do change a little as we age. They are activity specific. And if you've never tried heart rate training, just get yourself first, track it, get yourself a good heart rate monitor, put a strap on your chest is probably the better one. And then just track it somehow. And then start looking at the data, start asking questions. Honestly, there's tons of information on this out there. If you type in, how do I find my heart rate, my max heart rate, you will find all kinds of information on that. And that's great. I love you to be a student of the sport. I think it's really valuable to get out there and learn and apply things to you. And you're your best test subject, right? So if you're monitoring yourself and seeing what you can do, and then again, not limiting yourself, but see what you can hold. And you gain a lot of confidence, I think, through heart rate training, because if you look at those numbers, like I said, I know when I'm in a race and my heart rate's in the 180s that I can, I might at first have doubted, can I hold it there for this long? But I've done it so many times, so I know I can. It kind of calms you down because I've done that before. And I didn't die. I did it, right? I pushed myself to those levels, and I think that that's really, really valuable to do. One other thing I wanted to touch on, I've noticed with heart rate training, it's really hard to do heart rate training on a track. Because once you do like a 400 meter repeat, it's very hard for your heart rate goes up, but then it doesn't drop. Sometimes it will drop quickly. If you're in really good shape, actually, your heart rate will drop quickly after you slow down. And that's how you can tell you're in really good shape. But oftentimes it will, if you're maybe not as good a shape, it will take a while for it to drop down, and maybe it won't go up as high. So it's not very accurate, I think, when you're doing like 400 meter repeats. That, you don't have enough time to really see you don't go by heart rate, I would say there. But you've used that heart rate to figure out your pacing. And then once you figured out what that pacing is, then you can go off of those calculations and say, and that's what I do for my athletes. So they're not doing a lot of heart rate training at the track, but they're still got their heart rate monitor on. We can look at those results after the fact. But in terms of having some data to help you along in a race setting or half marathon or marathon, those numbers become even more important the longer we go. So, tempo runs are really important to know what your heart rate is. That way, you can go by pace, but the thing is, like when I told you before, a tempo run is 25 to 30 seconds slower per mile. Well, okay, that doesn't accommodate for terrain change. Tempo runs traditionally are done on flat, but not always. What if you're running on a rolling terrain and that pace changes? So I kind of value the heart rate numbers quite a lot, more than pacing. Sometimes we put a lot of, how many, your minute per mile. But the thing is, that changes. Even in a race, each mile isn't created equal. You have more incline in one, or you have a big decline in another. And so those are variable, but your heart rate doesn't change quite as much. So it's nice to look at those numbers, all of it, really, and you can put together a good race based on that. But again, heart rate spike would be different in terms of numbers for everyone. I do not like to see that when I look at numbers, and I don't want them to get their heart rate pushed too high too quickly. Knowing what those numbers are, and I will say one thing too, for a lot of people, your heart rate will climb throughout an event. So this steady little incline is okay too. I do like to see it pretty level. But when I start running a half marathon, I usually don't see 180 right away. I do see it in the first few miles, but I don't see it at mile 0.1 or anything in the race. It's kind of a steady climb, but it does average to that, and it is very subtle. And I think that's key with that. So yeah, if you've never done this before, get a heart rate strap, put it on, just start gathering the numbers. Even if you don't know what they mean, if you work with a coach, they might want to know what those numbers are for you. And the more data you can collect over time, especially with racing, it really helps you build the confidence to know what you're capable of doing in a race. So yeah, heart rate training is excellent. And hope that you start doing that. If you have any questions you want me to answer, please send them my way. You can find me on Instagram, and I've got some more information. I have a little clip I've recorded. You'll hear it after this, but you're welcome to message me. You can find my my information on my website too. So anyway, hope you have a great day and happy training. Until next time, live well. Thank you again for listening in to the podcast. I wanted to encourage you to like and subscribe, and please share this so others are learning about it so we can continue growing it. You can also find me on Instagram at The Blonde Runner, and that's BLONDE with an E on there. And you can also find me on Instagram at Coach Laura Erickson, and that's LORAERICKSON. And thanks again for listening in, and until next time, live well.